Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host of Killer Instinct. And before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well. So make sure you are subscribed. And if you're looking for more exclusive Killer Instinct content, you can always find that over on our Patreon. We post an additional 3 episodes a month on Patreon, and we end the month with an exclusive live stream as well. So all of the information for that can always be found in the description box below. And before we get started, if you are a video listener over on YouTube, you may be wondering, or maybe you've noticed, maybe you haven't, but if you have, you might be asking yourself, where are you? Because this is not the normal setup. This is not what it usually looks like. And if you've been following over on Patreon, then you would know that I have moved, which is the explanation for the different background. We're still trying to get adjusted with the lighting and figuring out exactly how we're going to make this space perfect for Killer Instinct. And it will be a little bit of a process, but I just wanted to address that. I felt like I couldn't just keep going forward without addressing that yes, we are in a new space. Yes, we are in a different space. It looks different. It is different. And we are going to make some tweaks and changes along the way. I'm open to hearing any and all suggestions that you may have. You can let me know those in the comments below as to what kind of space you envision for Killer Instinct. And I just wanted to point that out before we moved forward. But with that being said, let's jump to why we are here today, which is to discuss the brutal, horrific solved case of a young woman named Jessie Blodgett. So with that being said, let's jump right on into it. Jessie Blodgett was born in 1994 and raised in Hartford, Wisconsin by her parents, Joy and Buck Blodgett. Now, Hartford is a smaller community. It's a creative town and a beautiful place to raise a family. Jessie was an only child to her parents, and they grew up in a very close, tight-knit family. Her and her parents had a bond that was said to be indescribable. They would talk about anything and everything. They truly were each other's best friends. Jessie grew up as an energetic, bright, and vibrant young girl. She loved her family, she loved her friends, and she stood strong for the things that she believed in, which for her included the environment, animal rights, social justice, domestic violence, and specifically violence against women was something that Jessie was incredibly passionate about. She was known to be wise beyond her years and was described by many as an old soul. Jessie just cared. She cared about people. She cared about the people around her. She cared about those who were closest to her and those who weren't. She just cared. And that was one of the major takeaways I felt when researching and learning more about who Jessie was, is she just seemed like she cared about everyone. Something else that I learned about Jessie was the fact that she was incredibly musically gifted, whether that be the violin, piano, singing. She was able to get on a stage and perform beautifully. She started out playing piano in the 1st grade alongside her dad, Buck, and Buck said that this was something that they did together. And when Jessie got started in piano, he felt like it was something that he also needed to do in order for Jessie to stick to it. It was something where he said, you know, if she sees me doing it, she's going to feel more compelled to want to stick with it as well. But over time, Buck realized that he no longer needed to also play the piano with Jessie because Jessie was in a world of her own with the piano and she fell in love with music. It was her way of expressing herself. She was gifted. She participated in the school choir. She wrote her own music, and her parents remember a core memory of Jessie being Jessie performing at the school's talent show when she was in 8th grade. Jessie played the piano and sang to her own song, and her parents watched. They sat in the crowd and watched as the crowd lit Up. And not only did Jessie get a standing ovation for her performance, she also won the talent show. Jessie was so gifted and talented that after graduating from high school, she received a talent scholarship for the music education program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. This was incredibly exciting for Jessie and her family, who was so incredibly proud of her. Jessie's long-term goals were teaching music. She wanted to guide others in their journey through music and share her love of it as well. In the summer of 2013, Jessie had began her own business of teaching kids music lessons. She did this out of her own parents' home, offering piano, violin, or singing lessons to children of all ages, and the kids absolutely loved Jessie. So this case begins in July of 2013. And around this particular time, Jessie had been involved in a theater production of The Fiddler on the Roof, and she was cast as the fiddler. And the weekend of July 12th was the opening weekend for the production. It was the opening weekend for the show. And Jessie and the theater had performed Friday and Saturday, and then they had a casting party on Sunday. So Friday, Saturday were performances, cast party on Sunday. So with that weekend, it was a jam-packed weekend. It was a busy weekend. The morning of Monday, July 15th, it was Jessie's first day of summer, really. And it was her first day to sleep in because, like I said, they had a jam-packed weekend the couple days before it. The night prior, the casting party ran late, and Jessie's mom, Joy, had woken up that morning and prepared to go to work as normal. And prior to heading out the door, she did walk into Jessie's room and noticed that Jessie was still sleeping. Like I said, this wasn't concerning or anything out of the ordinary, considering the fact that Jessie had a busy weekend and her mom knew that Jessie wanted to sleep in on this particular day. So Joy dropped off Jessie's laundry in her bedroom, and then she walked out the door and headed to work that day, leaving Jessie in the home by herself. Joy returned home around lunchtime that day, and when she did, she noticed that Jessie was still upstairs. Now again, Joy wasn't thinking too much of this, so she began eating her lunch in the kitchen when she noticed that Jessie's music lesson client was now pulling up into the driveway for their scheduled lesson. When Joy saw this, she began calling out to Jessie, who was still upstairs, to let her know that her lesson had just arrived, but Joy wasn't getting an answer from Jessie. And at this point, Joy decided that she was going to walk upstairs and see why Jessie wasn't responding. And when Joy walked into Jessie's room, she saw Jessie, who was still sleeping in bed. She went up to Jessie's bedside to shake her awake, but that is when she realized that Jessie was not waking up. In fact, her body was cold and her face was blue. Immediately, Joy frantically called 911, saying that she needed help because her daughter was no longer breathing. Joy said that she wasn't sure what had happened and that all she knew was that Jessie was no longer responsive, and also pointed out that it appeared that Jessie had strangulation marks on her neck, but wasn't sure where they came from. She just kept repeating over and over, "She's cold and she's blue." Immediately after this 911 call was placed, EMS and police were dispatched to Jessie's family home. When they arrived, they raced up to Jessie's bedroom and noticed that Joy had moved Jessie from her bed, which is where she was found, to her bedroom floor. Joy did this in an effort to give Jessie CPR, which needed to be done on a flat surface, so that is why Joy moved her to the ground. When police walked over to look at Jessie and saw her body, specifically her head and neck, they could see that there was a marking around Jessie's neck that appeared to be a ligature mark, meaning that there was some sort of pressure that was applied to her neck. There was also bruising on her hands and her ankles. There was also some blood evidence found in her bed sheets and on her pillowcase on her bed. Joy also told police that when she discovered Jessie's body, her hair and her pants were wet. Jessie's hair and Jessie's pants were wet, as if she had been bathed, which this struck police as very odd. The crime scene being Jessie's bedroom, it appeared to be a little bit staged as well. After speaking with Joy, police learned that Jessie's body was found in her bed with the covers over her and her head resting on her pillow, almost as if someone wanted to make it appear that she was still sleeping. When police looked at the house as a whole, they were able to rule out that this was any sort of robbery gone wrong, as nothing from the home was taken, and there were many valuables that were left out in plain sight, such as cash on top of Jessie's piano that was left completely untouched. So things like that were proving to police that this was an isolated attack on Jessie. Now, news of Jessie's murder completely rattled the community of Hartford. No one could figure out who would want to do something like this, especially to Jessie. Everyone was feeling very uneasy knowing that there was a killer on the loose, and police definitely felt pressure because of that to solve this case and solve it quickly. Now, beginning their investigation, police felt like this had to have been someone who was familiar with Jessie. They had to know enough to be let into the home, as there was no sign of forced entry. And along with that, police felt like the killer knew where Jessie's bedroom was, proving more that this was someone that Jessie had to have known. Police had sent off any DNA that was left behind at the scene to the crime lab to see if there would be any hit to someone in the system, as well as to prove whether or not Jessie had been sexually assaulted. Given the state of Jessie's body when it was discovered, the coroner concluded that Jessie's murder occurred on the morning of July 15th. Now, while awaiting the results from the crime lab, detectives also found something in Jessie's bedroom that let them into more of Jessie's mindset the night prior to her murder. Now, police discovered that Jessie kept a diary that she very much kept up with, and she kept the diary by her bedside. When detectives took a look inside of the diary, they discovered that she had written a diary entry just hours before her murder. The entry read, quote, "I think I'm being corrupted. I think certain men are taking what should be platonic love and perverting it into a competition, whether they mean to or not, and in a way, I'm furious," end quote. So obviously, when police are reading this, this is giving them a sign that something was going on in Jessie's life that was making her feel this way. There was some sort of interaction, some sort of scenario that was taking place that made her feel the way that she was feeling. This diary entry was just hours before her murder, and police had a hard time believing that that was coincidental. So obviously, police wanted to know more about this cast party from the Fiddler on the Roof production. And in doing so, they learned through talking to other castmates at this cast party that Jessie seemingly had a great time at this cast party, which took place at a very cool farm property. There was a swimming pool, there were farm animals, and Jessie was seen having a really great time. She went up to the director and spoke to him for a while, the director of the production, telling him how much fun she had over the past week performing the shows, and then she returned home at approximately 1 a.m. Joy said that she heard Jessie walk in, and when she did, Joy got up to just touch base with Jessie and ask her how the party was. Joy said that immediately Jessie told her mom that she was a little uncomfortable and how she had an off-putting interaction with an older male castmate. Jessie identified this male castmate to her mom as 46-year-old Randy Talley, who was the choreographer for the show and also played a leading male role as well. Other cast members remembered seeing Jessie and Randy together at the party. One person remembered seeing Jessie sitting on Randy's lap while they were all sitting around the fire pit at one point, and the person who noticed this claimed that they felt a little unsettled given the age gap between Jessie and Randy, and they wondered if this was something that Jessie was comfortable with and okay with, but they also said that Jessie seemed fine. She seemed to be having a good time. She was laughing, she was smiling, and so this other cast member just decided to let it go. go. Now, police at this point obviously wanted to speak to Randy Talley, and they brought him in for a police interview. Randy told authorities that he was on call for his temp job on the morning of July 15th, but he actually hadn't gone into work that day. So he was just on call and he never got called in. So his alibi for police was that he had just slept in on the morning of the 15th and he spent the day on Facebook. He was also online sending out resumes and just hanging out at his house, but that was his only alibi. He agreed that there was some flirtation between Jessie and him during the cast party, and also explained that Jessie was one of his favorite people on the cast. Now, while he explained that he felt very close to her, nothing physical ever transpired between the two of them. Now, Randy also told police that he was in a very committed long-term relationship, and he also agreed to give his DNA over to police as well, which they happily took. All in all, Randy denied ever having anything to do with Jessie's murder and did not know who could have been responsible for it either. From police's standpoint, there was no denying that Randy felt some sort of connection to Jessie. He kept saying in the interview that he felt very close to her despite only knowing her for 6 weeks. He kept saying that he was a hugger, he was a touchy person, he was outwardly affectionate, but that didn't mean that he killed her. And ultimately, through Randy's phone records, which showed his movements for the day, police were able to confidently rule him out as a suspect in Jessie's case. Now, while Jessie's investigation was underway, detectives at the Washington County Sheriff's Office were also investigating a different attack that occurred in Richfield, Wisconsin, just 3 days prior to Jessie's murder and only about 15 minutes away from Hartford, Wisconsin, where Jessie lived. A young woman named Melissa Etzler was taking her dog on a walk at Richfield Historical Park on July 12th, 2013, and Melissa said that when she arrived to the park, she got out of her car with her dog, and just as normal, she was setting to embark out on a trail that she normally went to with her dog. However, this time, when she got out of her car, she noticed a man sitting in his van. She said that she didn't think too much of it at the time and continued her walk for approximately an hour and then turned around to begin walking back to her car. But Melissa said that as she was doing that and walking closer towards her car, she heard someone walking up behind her. Melissa said that she turned around and noticed that the man who was sitting in the van was now out of his car and running towards her. And this time she noticed that he had a knife in his hand. At this point, Melissa said that she was tackled to the ground and the man attacked her. And this is when Melissa's survival instincts really kicked in. She ended up grabbing the blade of the knife with her hand, trying her best to fight off her attacker and fight for her life. And ultimately, her attacker got up, ran back to his van, got in the car, and drove off, leaving Melissa on the ground. And luckily, she was still alive. Now, she still had the knife in her hand as well because the attacker ended up leaving it behind, and she and her dog quickly got up, got into her car, and they drove to her boyfriend's house, and his family was the one who called 911. Now, detectives met Melissa at the hospital because when paramedics met her at her boyfriend's home, they escorted her to the hospital to get her injuries looked at further. And when detectives met Melissa, she repeated the entire story to police as to what had happened, which is what I just told you. And during her recount of the attack, she told investigators that while she and her attacker were fighting on the ground, the man asked Melissa, "Can I go?" He actually, at a certain point, asked Melissa if he could leave because he realized that Melissa was not giving up. And then he started asking her, "Can I go?" Melissa told him that if he was going to go, she was going to keep the knife with her. That was the contingency on this. And that is when he let go of the knife and ran back to his car and quickly drove away. Melissa described her attacker as a white male with blonde hair and black glasses. She worked with a composite sketch artist and released the sketch of what the suspect looked like to the public. public. Detectives also went back and looked at the park itself, and in doing so, they found a mountain of evidence that was left behind. They found gum in the trash can of the park. They also found sunglasses and a roll of aluminum tape. Now, Melissa told authorities that the man who attacked her in the park was driving a blue minivan, and this became crucial to the investigation because 2 weeks prior to Melissa's attack, there was an officer who was doing a routine drive-through of the park, and he spotted this blue minivan. Now, the officer stated that the car wasn't any that he had seen prior. This was a very routine drive that he made, a very routine drive through the park specifically, and he had never seen this blue minivan before. And it wasn't a heavily trafficked area, so the blue minivan stood out, and the officer decided to run the plates on the car, but the owner came back as having no criminal history, and there was really just nothing suspicious about it other than it was this blue minivan sitting there. No one was in it, and the officer had never seen it before. So he just figured that the owners were walking on a trail in the park, and the officer left. It wasn't until after the officer heard about Melissa's attack and the blue minivan that the dots were starting to connect here. And the officer gave detectives who were working on Melissa's case the license plate of that blue minivan. And detectives ran that license plate, and that is when they discovered that the blue minivan was registered to a couple named Laura and Melvin Bartelt, who lived in Richfield. Now, given that this was really their only lead at the time, detectives went out to the Bartelts' home, and they confirmed that they did in fact have this blue minivan. They had the same car, and they also told detectives that their 20-year-old son would often use this car. Now, their son was a young man named Dan Bartelt. When detectives heard that, they then asked if they could speak to Dan, who wasn't home at the time, and Laura and Melvin then gave police Dan's phone number so they could reach him themselves. Detectives then called Dan and asked him to meet them down at the sheriff's office, which he was very willing to do, and they met him there. Now, interestingly enough, despite being taken in for questions regarding Melissa's attack, very quickly, police learned that there was a strong connection between Dan and Jessie Blodgett, and that was the fact that Dan was Jessie's high school boyfriend. He was also a straight-A student in high school. He was on the cross-country team. He came from a seemingly nice family. They both shared their passion for music. In high school, both Dan and Jessie both sat right next to each other in orchestra, and they were also in the choir together. They dated for approximately 3 months in high school, and Dan broke up with Jessie after that, but the two remained good friends throughout the remainder of high school and into college. Dan went to the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point for his freshman year of college. However, he did drop out after that and then went back to living at home with his parents. Dan's parents seemed to be very supportive. They wanted to give their son a safe landing after he left college and really give him some time to figure out what it was that he wanted to do with his life. All their request was from him was to get a job, which Dan claimed that he did. And he also was simultaneously still getting himself involved in theater. So he was able to have his passion, which was theater, music, while simultaneously having a more traditional job. Now, in fact, Dan was at Jessie's family home just a week prior to her murder, and the two were playing music together. The two were having a good time, so they still were able to maintain more than just a copacetic friendship, but a true friendship. Now, the day after Jessie's murder, a few of Jessie's friends were all invited over to Jessie's family home by Joy and Buck, her parents, and Dan was one of those friends. They all sat together with Jessie's parents and reminisced on the happy memories that they had of Jessie and her life. They told stories about her. They talked about all of their favorite things about Jessie. In the middle of the gathering, Dan's cell phone rang, and Dan actually excused himself into the dining room to answer the call. And when he came back, he announced that it was the police department asking him to come in for an interview. And that was the same interview that police went to Dan's family home and asked for him pertaining to Melissa's attack about. So when detectives went to Dan's family home to ask about the blue minivan, and Dan's family was explaining to detectives that it was actually Dan who more so drove the minivan, and police asked if Dan could come home so they could talk to him, Dan, the reason he wasn't home was because he was at Jessie's family's home with her parents, with all of Jessie's friends, and reminiscing on Jessie's life. Now, when Dan got off the phone, he walked back into the room where Jessie's parents were and where some of Jessie's other friends were, and announced that the police department wanted him to come in for an interview. And it was actually Jessie's mom, Joy, who told Dan not to worry, considering that police were probably going to want to speak to all of Jessie's friends. And one of Dan and Jessie's other friends who were also at Jessie's home during that time, they drove Dan to the police station and dropped him off there and assumed that this interview was not going to last very long. In fact, Dan told this specific friend to just pick him back up in 30 minutes. Now, what none of Jessie's friends or her parents knew at that time was that this interview was not about Jessie, as everyone had assumed. This was about the park attack on Melissa. Now, when sitting down with detectives, Dan initially denied ever being involved in any park attack. Dan had a cut on his finger, which he stated was from work. It was a work injury, but detectives had a hunch that it was much more than that. Off of just a gut instinct, one detective had asked Dan if they were to contact his place of employment, would they still tell them that Dan had a job there? Would they confirm that Dan was working for their company? And this is when Dan confessed and admitted that he had left his previous job, and he didn't tell police because he hadn't admitted this to his parents yet. His parents had no idea that he wasn't working this job any longer, and he didn't want them to know that he wasn't working this job any longer. Now, since he confessed that he was no longer working at his previous job, that meant he obviously did not cut his finger there either. He couldn't have cut his finger at his job if his job did not exist. But Dan said that there was an explanation for this as well. He now said that he cut his finger on a knife, but not during an attack. He claimed that he cut his finger on a knife while he was cooking at home. Now, detectives are not believing this, because why would you not just say that to begin with? If you cut your finger cooking, why not just start there? Why make up a lie about how you cut it at work when you know that there's no job that you could have even cut it at? Why go there? So they are now amping up the pressure with Dan. This quickly turned from an interview to an interrogation. And this is when detectives tell Dan that they did not believe him, and they pressured Dan further by telling him that there was blood DNA left behind at the park where Melissa's attack took place, and they would be able to connect that blood back to him and prove that he was there at the time of the attack. So it might as well just be better if he admitted to it now. And this intimidation tactic actually seemed to work because it got Dan talking. He admitted that yes, he did attack Melissa in the park, but his reasoning was not what authorities were expecting. Dan told authorities that the reason that he attacked Melissa in the park was because he wanted to scare her. Dan explained that life scared him. He was scared of life. He was scared of the things that were happening to him. He was scared of the things that were happening around him. And he looked around and he saw that everyone else just seemed comfortable in their life. Everyone else seemed happy, and he wanted to scare others just as life scared him. Is that believable? Because it wasn't to the authorities, but it really didn't matter. They now had enough evidence and a confession, regardless of the reasoning. They had a confession. Dan is sitting here admitting he attacked Melissa. So they now had enough to arrest Dan, and they did, with attempted murder and endangering safety for the attack on Melissa. Now, throughout this interrogation and prior to his arrest, there were several comments that were made by Dan that stood out to authorities. Right when Dan sat down with police, they asked him how he got to the station. He explained that friends had driven him over to the station and that he was previously at Jessie Blodgett's house. Now, this immediately had a light bulb go off for authorities because they knew that Jessie Blodgett was a young woman who had just been murdered. So curious, police asked Dan if he knew anything about what happened to Jessie, and he said that all he knew is that Jessie had been raped and murdered. Again, all he knew was that Jessie had been raped and murdered. Why is this important? This is important because this was not public knowledge. Jessie being raped was inside information to only authorities who were still actually at the time processing the DNA that was found on Jessie's body to determine whether or not she even had been sexually assaulted. So her being raped was only information that the killer would have known. So now police's skepticism is growing further, not just for Melissa's case because they had him on Melissa's attack, but now there is suspicion growing towards Dan for Jessie's murder. And after taking a closer look at Dan, they were starting to see the inconsistencies in his life. For example, his job. Again, when he dropped out of college, his parents told him, you need to get a job. He said that he got the job, and then he confessed to police that he was let go of the job or he quit the job. But quickly, police were able to determine that in itself was not true. Not only did Dan never even have a job to begin with after he dropped out of college, he never even applied for a job after he dropped out. But for months, he was pretending like he was going into work every day. He would wake up at 5:30 a.m., he would pack his lunch, put together his work belongings, and drive away from home, pretending that he was going to work every single day. When in fact, what he was really doing was going to parks and spending time lurking throughout the day. So at this point, after Dan's arrest, the detectives who were working on Melissa's case became aware of Dan's connection to Jessie, and they reached out to the investigators who were working on Jessie's case and told them that they had someone that Jessie's investigators might want to interview. So detectives in Hartford then went to the jail where Dan was being held to hold an interview with him pertaining to Jessie's case. Now, Dan was initially very open in speaking with detectives. He spoke about how great Jessie was as a person and all the amazing qualities that she had, and was acting very emotional about her loss. However, there were no tears. Not a single one. It was a lot of pretending to be upset, a lot of pretending to cry, but no real tears coming from him. He also told authorities that on the morning of Jessie's murder, he had an alibi. He was out at a park on the morning of Jessie's murder. He claimed that he was at Woodlawn Park that morning, but after being pressed further, Dan said that he was feeling uncomfortable. He felt like the authorities were insinuating that he had something to do with Jessie's murder, and he asked for a lawyer. So the conversation had to end there. Now that they were no longer able to talk to Dan directly without his lawyer, police decided to look closer into Dan's alibi that he gave authorities. Again, he said that he was at Woodlawn Park, and there were actually security cameras at Woodlawn Park. So they looked into the footage and found that Dan was in fact actually at the park that morning at 10 o'clock a.m. on Monday, July 15th. So this confirmed what Dan had said about being there that morning. However, this does not answer the question of where Dan was prior to that. So before 10 a.m., where was Dan? That was now the question. So at this point, detectives spoke with the park officials, and through this, they learned that the last time that trash was collected at the park, where the trash would be taken away, was at 7:30 a.m. on Monday the 15th. And again, Dan was seen at 10 a.m., so after the the trash would have already been taken for that week. Now, this was several days after Jessie's murder when police were learning about the trash at the park. But the question here that detectives had was if there was a possibility that Dan threw away something in the garbage that could help them consolidate a timeline for Dan. And that was the hope. The hope was finding something in the trash that would prove where Dan was and around what time. But following that trail and following down that path in the investigation, police discovered much, much more than they could have ever anticipated. In going through one of the trash cans at the entrance of the park, detectives discovered a Frosted Mini Wheats cereal box that was open, and inside, all of the cereal was gone. There was no cereal in the box, but what was in the box was a murder kit. Police discovered a rope, alcohol wipes, a ball gag, and the same type of tape, that same aluminum tape that was discovered at Melissa's park attack crime scene. The discovery of this was so much more than police ever anticipated finding, but now the critical question was, can police connect these items to Dan specifically? They have these items, which is crucial to the investigation, but what's even more crucial is proving that it was Dan who these items belonged to. So detectives sent all of these items to the crime lab, and not only did the crime lab confirm that Dan's DNA was on the items, but they also confirmed that Jessie's DNA was on these items as well. Jessie's DNA was discovered on the antiseptic wipes that were found in the box. Dan's fingerprints were found in the box, and inside the items of the box, there was also a hair strand that belonged to Jessie, and this was all the confirmation that police needed. Dan was now being charged with the first-degree intentional homicide of the murder of Jessie Blodgett, and he pled not guilty. So now this case was headed to trial. The prosecution was looking into the relationship between Jessie and Dan to prepare them for trial, and in doing so, they made a very chilling discovery from a Facebook post that Jessie made about a month and a half prior to her murder. The Facebook post read, quote, "When Dan Bartelt breaks into your house while you're sleeping to awaken you. After woods walking and spectacular music making, I'd say it was worth it. Might post the music later." End quote. Now, some of Jessie's friends were very quick to point out that this was very odd behavior and that this was very weird. There was a lot of question marks. It was a lot of, what do you mean? He just walked into your house while you were sleeping. And Jessie actually added on in reply to one of the comments that was left behind saying, quote, "He walked into my house and then my room while I was still in bed. What a freak." End quote. Jessie definitely seemed to be more lighthearted when talking about it. It was seeming to be coming off in like a joking manner, but knowing what we know now, it is very disturbing and very chilling to read that, just knowing how everything unfolded. Detectives and prosecution believe that that incident in particular was a practice run for Dan. Dan walking into the house while Jessie was sleeping, waking her up, he wanted to see if he could break into the home and get into her bedroom. Now, 13 months after Jessie's murder, Dan was now heading to trial for Jessie's murder charge. More DNA had come out against Dan during the trial that was again going back to the aluminum tape that was found at Melissa's crime scene and in the cereal box. Because that same tape, that same type of tape was also found in Dan's home, and also, it was found underneath Jessie's bed, and that roll under her bed contained Dan's fingerprints all over it. Along with that, the rope that was found in the cereal box, that same type of rope was also found at Dan's home. That specific rope also had Dan and Jessie's DNA on it, and specifically Dan's DNA was found at the end of the rope, and Jessie's DNA was found in the middle of the rope, and Dan's DNA was also found under Jessie's fingernail. So there was more than enough DNA evidence here. Now, Dan's computer history was also brought up during the trial, and it was brought up because his computer search history consisted of many searches of serial killers, graphic, violent pornography, sexual assault, and homicide searches. Now, the defense, on the other hand, they tried to argue that Jessie and Dan were friends and that there was no reason that Dan would have to kill Jessie. But the decision ultimately came down to the jury. It was in the jury's hands. And in just 3 hours, the jury found that Dan Bartelt was guilty of the murder of Jessie Blodgett. Now, the conviction against Dan, when it comes to Jessie's family, they obviously do not see this as a victory. Jessie is still gone, but they do feel a sense of peace knowing that there was justice. During Dan's sentencing, he did make a statement to Jessie's family. He spoke directly to her parents, looking right at them, and again maintained his innocence, saying that the shackles and orange jumpsuit don't mean that he's guilty and that he's so sorry for their loss and that he loved them. Jessie's dad, Buck, also gave a very powerful and moving statement during the sentencing. He spoke mainly of Jessie and how amazing she was, but he also spoke to Dan, saying that he forgave Dan and that he felt no hatred in his heart for Dan, and that decision wasn't for Dan, it was for him and his family and for Jessie. Shortly after Jessie's murder, Jessie's parents started the Love is Greater Than Hate project in honor of Jessie. Their whole mission is that the more love that there is, the less violence there will be, and they're trying to exemplify that. I will put the link to the foundation in the description box below. They have held many presentations, gatherings, and they spread awareness. Their mission statement is, quote, ending interpersonal violence, promoting forgiveness, and presenting love, end quote. Her parents said that they knew they needed to create something good for the loss that they had endured, and that is when the Love is Greater Than Hate project was born. So that, you guys, is the case of Jessie Blodgett. I'm very curious to know your thoughts on it. Definitely let me know in the comments below. But with that being said, you guys, it's going to be all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host. Make sure you go ahead, hit that subscribe button if you have not already. We are here every single Wednesday on the podcast and on YouTube. All the links to the Patreon can also be found in the description box below for those exclusive episodes. I will be back next week with a brand new one for you guys. And until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.